Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Edgar Allan Poe. The story is called Hop Frog. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to favor. This had happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as intimidable jokers. Whether people grew fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rava avis enteris. About the refinements, or it as it called them, the ghosts of wit, the troubled king himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in the jest, and would often be put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties worried him. He would have preferred Rebigelus's Garantua to zigzags of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than the verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not gone altogether out of fashion at court. Several of the great continual powers still remained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells, and who were expected to always be ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as of course, matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of a folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men, who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, his professional jester, was not only a fool, however, his value was trembled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days of rather long at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. Both, as I have already observed, your jesters in 99 cases out of 100 are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self graduation with our king that in Hopfrog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hawkfrog was not given to the dwarf by his sponsors of baptism, but it was conferred upon him in general by consent of the 7 ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hopfrog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wiggle, a movement and afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king, for notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital future. But although Hopfrog, through his distortion of his legs, could only move with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor with prodigious muscular power, which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity where trees and ropes were in question or anything else to climb. In such exercises, he constantly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I'm not able to say what precision from what country Hopfrog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, the vast distance from the court of our king. Hopfrog and a young girl, very less dwarfish than himself, although in exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, have been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of the ever victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered if that a close intimacy arose between the 2 little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hopfrog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, he had not in his power to render Tripetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hopfrog and Tripetta were sure to be called into play. Hopfrog, in especial, was so inventive in the ways of getting up the pageants, suggesting novel characters and arranging costumes for marked balls, and nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted under Tripetta's eye with every kind of device which could possibly give élat to the masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation, for as costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that every day everybody had come to the decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume a week or even a month in advance, and in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated, I never could tell unless they did it by way of a joke, more probably than found it difficult on account of being so fat it made up their minds. At all events, time flew, and at a last resort, they sent for Tripetta and Hopfrog. When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting in his wine with the 7 members of the cabinet council, and the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, for he excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes and took pleasure in forcing Hopfrog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hopfrog," he said as a jester and his friends entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends," here Hopfrog sighed, "and then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters, men, something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with our everlasting sameness. Come, drink, the wine will brighten your wits." Hopfrog endeavored as usual to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be a poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced his tears in his eyes. Many large bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant. "Ah ha ha ha," roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "So what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow, his large eyes glimmed rather than shone, for the effect of wine was an excitable brain with no more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the prime minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, Hopfrog, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow, we stand in the need of characters, all of us. Ha ha ha, and this is very serious, meant for a joke." His laugh was caressed by the 7. Hopfrog was also laughed, also feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come, come," said the king impatiently, "have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf, abstractly, as he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring," cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you think by that? As I perceive, you are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this," and he poured out another full goblet and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, grasping for breath. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster, "or by the fiends." The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Tripetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat, and falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for somewhat moment in evident wonder of her audacity. He seemed quite at the loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best as she could, and not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about a half a minute, during which the falling of the leaf or of the feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh, protracted, grating sound, which seemed to come at once from the corner of the room. What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly from quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I, how could I have been me?" The sound appeared to come from without, observed one of the courtiers. I fancied it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires. True, replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion, but on the honor of the knight, I could have sworn that it was gritting at the vagabond's teeth. Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified and have drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect. Hogfrog entered at once, and with the spirit into the plans for the masquerade. I cannot tell what the association of idea observed. He very tranquilly, as if he had never tasted wine in his life, but just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here, as it was be altogether, new altogether, unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons. And here we are, cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. 8 to the fraction, I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion? We call it, replied the cripple, the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is an excellent sport if well enacted. We will enact it, remarked the king, drawing him and lowering his eyelids. The beauty of the game, continued Hopfrog, lies in the fright it's occasioned among the women. Capital, roared in chorus of the monarch and his ministry. I will equip you as orangutans, proceeded the dwarf. Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking, and the company of masqueraders will take you for your real beast, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished. Oh, this is exquisite, exclaimed the king. Hopfrog, I will make you a man of you. The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at the masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable. It must be, said the king, and the council rose hurriedly as it was growing late, but in an execution the scheme of Hopfrog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, in the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and it is the ambitions made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous. Their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stocking knit shirts and drawers. They were saturated with tar. And this was the strange of a process. Some of one the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brood was an orangutan with much more efficiently replaced by flax. A thickening coat of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of the tar. The long chain was now procured. First it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, and then about successively in the same manner. When his chaining arranged was complete and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hopfrog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at 2 right angles across the circle, as the fashion adopted and at the present day by those who captured chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand salon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty and receiving the light of the sun only through the single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally at a large chandelier, depending on the chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by the means of a counterbalance as usual, but in order not to look unsightly, this ladder passed out the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Tripetta's superintendence, and in some particulars it seems that she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed, its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the salon, could not all be expected to keep out of its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the way, and a flambeau emitting sweet odor was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, from 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hopfrog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. The sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in altogether, for the impediments of their chains caused most of their party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there was not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the salon, his party might have soon have expedited the frolic in their blood. As it was, the general rush was made to the doors, but the king had observed them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and as the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. When the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the change of which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and by which it had been drawn up upon its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend, till it hooked extremely, came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course in immediately contact with the chain. They were thus situated. The dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, incited them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions, which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of the reach, and as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set out a loud shout of laughter in the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me," now screamed Hopfrog, his shrill voice making easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. I can only get a good look at them. I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the head of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatides, he returned as he went to the center of the room, leaped with his agility at the monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, and the chain flew violently up at about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in midair between the skylight and the floor. Hopfrog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained its relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as through endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at the accent, that the dead silence at about the minute's duration ensued. It was broken by such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attached the attention of the king and his counselors. From the former threw of the wine in the face of Tripetta, but on the present occasion there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the unturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha," said at length the infuriated jester, "aha, to begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king very closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude, who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without a power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flame, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and as he made his movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what matter of people these maskers are. They are the great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog the jester, and this is my last jest. Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf was scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of the vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Tripetta, stationed on the roof of the salon, had been an accomplice to her friend in his fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again. We say thank to Edgar Allan Poe about Hopfrog and the king and the masquerade party that they all attended. Sounds like Eyed Wise Shut. So anyway, if you like or enjoy anything I'm doing here, have a nice day.